Hi, my name is Tiffany. I'm 28, and I've spent most of my life trying to earn the attention of my parents, only to realize they didn't show up for my wedding. That night was supposed to celebrate me, but their absence felt like a punch straight to my heart. Years of being invisible led me here, standing in my own light. I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about family drama, emotional courage, and the unexpected turns life throws our way. I remember that evening as if it were carved into my memory with sharp, unyielding lines. The church smelled of polished wood and fresh lilies, their scent mingling with the faint aroma of vanilla candles scattered along the aisle. I had spent weeks imagining this night. The laughter, the applause, the looks of pride in my parents' eyes. I had imagined a moment that confirmed my existence to them, a night where finally I would be the focus. But as I stepped into the grand hall, my stomach twisted when I noticed the two empty chairs at the front row, reserved for my mother and father. The room was alive with chatter, the low hum of distant conversations filling the space like a soft blanket over my shock. My eyes flitted from face to face, searching, hoping for the familiar silhouettes of my parents. Nothing. Their absence was a loud statement in a room full of people, louder than any words they could have spoken. I felt an odd mix of anger and disbelief, as though the world had momentarily tilted on its axis. My husband, David, squeezed my hand gently. His warmth was a tether, grounding me as my heart threatened to betray itself with a storm of emotion. "They're going to come," he whispered, as though words alone could conjure their appearance. But deep down I knew the truth. They had chosen to be absent, to ignore the most significant milestone of my life, and nothing I could say or do would change that fact. The ceremony began, and the soft music from the string quartet wrapped around me like a comforting but mocking presence. I tried to focus on the vows, on the words of commitment and love, but each line echoed emptily when I thought of the parents who should have been there. My eyes watered, though I forced myself to blink rapidly, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. I reminded myself that this night was mine, a milestone achieved despite their indifference. As the officiant spoke, my mind wandered to the subtle signs of parental neglect that had defined my life. I remembered my 16th birthday, when they had promised a celebration, but were too busy with their own social plans to notice. I remembered graduations, holidays, family gatherings, all occasions where their presence was either a whisper or completely absent. And now, on the night meant to celebrate me, history repeated itself. The familiarity of their absence stung worse than any new wound. Friends and family tried to fill the silence left by my parents' absence. Cousins offered polite smiles, aunts whispered soft encouragements, and childhood friends raised glasses in cheer. I appreciated the gestures, I truly did, but it was a hollow kind of warmth. Every congratulations, Tiffany, felt like a reminder that while others could acknowledge my success, the two people whose validation I craved were nowhere to be found. During the reception, I walked among the tables, exchanging small talk and laughter. Yet, every time someone asked about my parents, my chest tightened. I offered vague responses, careful not to reveal the full depth of my disappointment. "Oh, they couldn't make it," I said, my voice measured and calm, though inside, frustration simmered. I could sense the curiosity in their eyes, the unspoken question of why my parents would skip such an important event. The truth was complicated, too complicated to share in passing conversation, but it burned behind my carefully maintained composure. At one point, my maid of honor pulled me aside. "Tiff, I can see it in your eyes," she said softly. "You wanted them here." I nodded, unable to speak for a moment, tears threatening to spill despite the control I fought to maintain. She gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. But look at all the people who do care. That's what matters tonight. I forced a smile, knowing she was right, yet unable to shake the sharp edge of disappointment that wrapped around my chest. Later, as I made my way to the dance floor for the first dance with David, I felt every eye in the room on me, yet the most important ones were missing. We moved together, swaying to the gentle rhythm of the music, but I felt the echoing emptiness where my parents' pride should have been. Each twirl reminded me that I had built a life independent of their approval, yet a part of me still longed for the simple acknowledgement that I existed in their eyes. Dinner was served, and the laughter and clinking of glasses created a rhythm that contrasted sharply with my inner turmoil. I noticed my parents' absence at every table, every conversation, like an invisible presence that haunted the edges of the celebration. The caterers passed trays of food, the aroma of roasted chicken and garlic mashed potatoes filling the room, yet the sensory richness did nothing to soften the sting of abandonment. I forced myself to eat, pretending to enjoy the flavors, but every bite reminded me of the emotional hunger their absence had created over the years. A small incident later, that evening underscored the depth of my feelings. My little cousin, unaware of the tension, pointed to the empty chairs and asked innocently, "Where are Tiffany's parents?" Laughter bubbled from the table around us, but I froze, my heart tightening like a vice. I knelt to speak gently to her. "They couldn't come tonight, sweetie." "But that's okay," I said, my voice trembling slightly. She nodded, unaware of the complex emotions her simple question had stirred. In that moment, I realized how deeply I had hoped they would show up, and how that hope had become a quiet ache that lingered long after childhood ended. As the night wore on, I found brief solace in the attention and support of those who had chosen to be present. David's friends laughed with me. My work colleagues clinked glasses in celebration, and my family by choice, friends who had become like sisters, offered quiet, heartfelt congratulations. Yet even as I smiled and laughed, a quiet tension remained in my chest, a reminder that true acknowledgement had not arrived from those whose validation had meant the most. Toward the end of the night, I found a quiet corner of the reception hall, away from the chatter and music. I leaned against the wall, taking a moment to breathe, letting the emotions I had restrained all evening surface. Memories of neglect and small betrayals flashed in my mind, birthdays forgotten, milestones overlooked, conversations dismissed. And in that quiet corner, I made a silent vow. I would survive, thrive, and create a life that proved my worth, not for them, but for myself. Even the smallest gestures throughout the night carried layered meanings. When a neighbor offered a toast, I felt a pang of longing for my parents' words instead. When my younger brother whispered, "I'm proud of you, Tiff," I clutched his hand, grateful for what he offered, yet acutely aware that he had not been the one whose pride I had truly craved. Each interaction layered my emotions further, a mixture of gratitude, sadness, and simmering resolve. The night ended with the cutting of the cake, a moment I had imagined being shared with my parents. David and I laughed as frosting accidentally smeared across our fingers, friends cheering and capturing photos. Yet in the back of my mind, I felt a persistent emptiness, a reminder that their absence had defined the evening more than the celebration itself ever could. I realized that while others could offer joy and recognition, some wounds ran too deep to be erased in a single night. Finally, as the guests began to leave and the lights dimmed, I stood by the exit, thanking everyone who had taken the time to celebrate me. Each hug, each farewell smile, offered warmth, but it could not fully fill the void left by the people whose approval had always seemed essential to me. In the quiet aftermath, I allowed myself a single, private moment to acknowledge the hurt, the disappointment, and the deep, unspoken anger that had accompanied their absence. And yet, as I walked hand in hand with David to our car, I felt the first flicker of clarity. This night, though painful, had revealed something powerful. I could celebrate myself. I could exist, be recognized, and build a life worthy of acknowledgement, even without my parents. That realization planted the seeds of a journey that would soon take me to places they had never imagined, places where they would be forced to recognize my existence, not for their pride, but for the proof of my own resilience. The night of my wedding faded into memory, but its sting did not. Walking hand in hand with David to our car, the quiet hum of the city around us felt almost like a lullaby for the aching heart I had carried for years. That night should have been a culmination of every milestone, yet it was instead a reminder of everything missing, the constant, invisible absence of my parents. And in the days and months that followed, that absence became a lens through which I saw my life, shaping it in ways I couldn't have predicted. David and I settled into our first apartment together, a modest two-bedroom space with peeling paint in the corners and a single window that let in golden afternoon sunlight. It wasn't much, but it was ours, a small sanctuary away from judgment. Still, every little task, from fixing the leaky faucet to rearranging the shelves, carried a weight I hadn't anticipated. The feeling of having to prove myself, financially, emotionally, socially, was relentless, a quiet pressure that no one else seemed to notice. Each bill paid, every grocery bag carried upstairs, and every late night at work felt like a silent declaration. I could survive on my own, even if the people who were supposed to care most had forgotten I existed. I took on more shifts at the bookstore, where I had been working since college. Standing behind the counter, the scent of worn paper and fresh ink wrapped around me like a protective blanket. Customers came and went, some eager to chat about the latest bestseller, others lost in their own worlds, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing inside me. Each interaction carried an undertone I couldn't shake, the idea that life was moving forward without acknowledgement from the people I had hoped would cheer for me. There was no celebratory call after a successful work week, no casual check-ins, nothing. Only the hum of fluorescent lights and the scratch of pens as customers scribbled down notes on scraps of paper. Some days were easier than others. I would sit with David after closing hours, sipping lukewarm coffee from chipped mugs, and we would talk about everything and nothing. I loved those quiet evenings, where the world felt contained and manageable. And yet, even in those moments, the absence of my parents was like a shadow at the edge of my vision, always reminding me that while others could see my accomplishments, the people whose approval mattered most could not, or would not, acknowledge them. Their absence had become almost a physical weight, pressing down on my shoulders, making me ache in ways that casual conversations or small victories could not erase. One evening, my phone rang just after I had finally started to relax. It was my mother. My heart jumped, a mixture of hope and dread twisting together. "Tiffany," she said, her voice clipped and formal. "We wanted to see how things are going." I froze, staring at the screen as if it held some secret truth I had yet to discover. I forced my voice to remain calm, careful not to let the years of hurt spill into the conversation. "We're doing well," I said, keeping it neutral. She asked a few questions, none of which reflected genuine curiosity. They were perfunctory, a checklist of polite concern. I listened, feeling the familiar mixture of longing and frustration, knowing that I could hang up at any moment, yet I stayed, silently enduring the hollow interaction. Work became both a refuge and a battleground. I poured myself into tasks that required meticulous attention, from organizing inventory to helping customers find rare editions of books. There was something soothing about the structure of the work, a rhythm that demanded focus and rewarded diligence. Yet, at night, when the lights were dim and the store emptied, the silence pressed against me. It reminded me that despite all the effort, despite every little step forward, I was largely invisible to the people I had always wanted to notice me. Their absence was not just physical, It had seeped into my identity, shaping the way I measured my worth against the shadows of neglect. There were moments when anger bubbled to the surface, small eruptions that I had to suppress in public. One Saturday, my father called while I was shelving books. His voice carried the same critical tone it always did, dripping with comparisons and implied disappointment. "Why haven't you advanced in your career like your brother?" he asked. I gritted my teeth, balancing a stack of novels in my arms. Every nerve in my body screamed to respond with the truth that I had survived, that I had built a life from scratch without their support, without their approval. Instead, I smiled politely and said, "I'm doing my best." Hanging up, I felt the familiar mix of relief and bitterness, the strange satisfaction that came from knowing I hadn't let them see me break down completely. Even in mundane, everyday moments, their absence was palpable. Grocery shopping became an exercise in quiet frustration. Walking past the aisles where I remembered shopping with my mother as a child, the memory of her laughter echoing in my ears. Visiting relatives or attending casual family gatherings was a delicate dance of appearances. Everyone else seemed to have parents who showed up, who asked questions, who celebrated milestones, and I had to smile while quietly measuring the void left by my own. Each event was a reminder of what I lacked, and yet, somehow, I kept moving forward, determined not to let absence define me entirely. David became my anchor, his presence a steady reassurance in a world that often felt indifferent. Yet even our relationship carried its own set of challenges. There were nights when I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying phone calls, imagining what it would have been like to have parents who supported us genuinely. David would sense my unease, running his fingers through my hair or whispering gentle reassurances. "We're enough," he would say softly, but I knew the truth. Sometimes enough wasn't about us. It was about the people who should have been there all along, whose recognition had been withheld. Financial struggles added another layer to the tension. Every paycheck had to be meticulously budgeted. Every purchase weighed against necessity. I saved quietly, setting aside small amounts with the distant hope of one day achieving a dream that didn't require parental approval, but would serve as undeniable proof of my capability. Each deposit into the savings account felt like a small victory, a quiet rebellion against the years of neglect. And yet, there was a bittersweet edge to it, a realization that the life I was building was both a sanctuary and a statement, a way to prove my worth to the very people who had refused to acknowledge it for so long. Social interactions became both a refuge and a challenge. Friends were supportive, celebrating promotions, birthdays, and small achievements, but even their enthusiasm sometimes reminded me of what I was missing. At a colleague's birthday dinner, I laughed and raised a toast, yet in the back of my mind, I imagined how my parents would react, or rather, fail to react. Their absence had created an invisible measure, a standard of validation that no amount of external recognition could fully satisfy. It was a silent, persistent ache, the kind that lives beneath the surface, shaping reactions, choices, and even dreams. One particularly difficult day, I received an invitation to my father's workplace retirement party. I considered attending, hesitant to show up empty-handed, yet curious if he would even acknowledge my accomplishments. I went, dressed in a modest but elegant outfit, and watched as colleagues praised his career. When he saw me, there was a flicker of surprise, quickly masked by a forced smile. He shook my hand, formally, a faint nod of recognition, but the warmth I had imagined never arrived. Walking home afterward, I realized that my entire life had been a series of half measures and empty gestures, and that the validation I craved was rarely, if ever, genuine. Amidst the struggles, small victories became life rafts. The first time I managed to save enough for a week-long trip with David, exploring a nearby state park, and staying in a small cabin, I felt an exhilarating sense of independence. We hiked through trails lined with pine and oak watched the sun rise over misty valleys, and shared simple meals under the open sky. For the first time in years, I felt the pure joy of living on my own terms, unburdened by parental judgment. And yet, even in these moments of clarity, the shadow of absence lingered, a reminder that my life's victories were mine alone, rarely witnessed by the people whose approval had always mattered most. Then came the moments of reflection that often occurred late at night. Sitting at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, I would think about the pattern of neglect and indifference that had followed me since childhood. Birthdays, holidays, graduations, weddings, milestones meant to celebrate life, achievement, and growth had been met with absence, criticism, or indifference. It wasn't always loud or dramatic. Often, it was the quiet, almost invisible lack of acknowledgement that hurt the most, the feeling that no matter what I achieved, it might never be enough to earn recognition, lingered persistently like a shadow over every decision. Through it all, I began to notice a subtle shift within myself. The frustration and disappointment that had defined my interactions with my parents slowly transformed into determination. Each struggle, each ignored milestone became a stepping stone toward independence. I started pursuing opportunities one had once feared, taking evening classes in business management, learning to navigate budgets, and slowly building a foundation that was resilient to the whims of parental approval. The invisible struggle became less about being acknowledged and more about proving to myself that I could thrive, regardless of external validation. Even small domestic achievements carried profound meaning. Learning to cook meals from scratch, repairing furniture, balancing household accounts. These tasks, mundane to outsiders, became symbols of my self-reliance. I discovered that competence in everyday life carried its own quiet dignity, a recognition that no amount of parental absence could erase. Each completed project, each task accomplished without their guidance or approval, reinforced a sense of self-worth that had long been denied. And yet, despite the growing strength, there were still days when the weight of invisibility pressed heavily. Moments like receiving a package from a friend and imagining how my parents would dismiss it, or walking through the bookstore where I worked and seeing empty chairs reserved for family during book signings, reminded me that the struggle was ongoing. It was invisible, yes, but deeply felt, a quiet, persistent challenge that shaped not just my actions, but my understanding of love, recognition, and personal worth. By the time 2 years had passed since the wedding, the pattern of struggle had solidified into a rhythm. I had learned to navigate life with resilience, to find meaning in accomplishments that others might overlook. I savored victories privately, celebrated milestones quietly, and allowed myself moments of joy even in the absence of external validation. And while the pain of parental neglect never completely faded, it became a driving force, a reminder that the life I built was mine alone, a testament to perseverance, self-reliance, and the quiet strength forged through years of invisible struggle. The months of struggle, the late nights balancing work, bills, and emotional exhaustion, all seemed to crystallize one ordinary Saturday morning. David and I had decided to run errands together, stopping at the grocery store and the nearby hardware shop to pick up a few essentials. The sun glinted off the polished streets, casting reflections across parked cars, and for a moment, I felt a sense of quiet normalcy, an almost fragile peace that made the past few years' hardships seem like a distant echo. I parked the old sedan we had been using, stepping out and stretching as I glanced at the lot. That's when I saw it, a brand new Porsche 911, its metallic red paint glinting in the morning sun, parked in a corner spot with an almost defiant shine. I had been dreaming of this moment for years, though never quite like this, never imagining it would carry more than just personal pride. This car wasn't just a purchase. It was a declaration, a testament to the quiet victories David and I had achieved together, the invisible struggles that had shaped me into someone who could finally say without hesitation that I existed and thrived. I had bought the car myself, with savings meticulously accrued over the years, working side jobs, putting every small victory into tangible progress. There had been late nights in front of spreadsheets, calculating how much I could set aside after rent, groceries, and unexpected expenses. Every dollar felt like a small battle won against the years of neglect and dismissal. And now, here it was, a symbol not of vanity, but of survival, of resilience, a quiet scream to the world that Tiffany could stand on her own. David squeezed my hand as we approached the Porsche. His eyes widened in admiration, not for the status it represented, but for the triumph it symbolized. "You did it, Tiff," he whispered. "All those years, you finally made it." I smiled, a mix of pride and something darker swirling beneath the surface. Pride for the life we had built, yes, but also a simmering anticipation, a quiet thought that this moment, seemingly ordinary to the casual observer, might finally pierce the invisible barrier my parents had maintained for decades. We lingered near the car, admiring the sleek lines and the polished interior, when I noticed movement from the other side of the lot. At first, it was subtle, a shadow, a familiar shape hesitating near the hardware store. My heart clenched, a mixture of shock and disbelief twisting together. It was them, my parents, not walking into the store, not making some casual errand. No, they had frozen in place, staring at the car like it had suddenly rewritten the rules of reality. I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. After years of being invisible, the people who had once defined my world through neglect were finally forced to acknowledge my presence, not me, not my accomplishments, but the car. My chest tightened as I watched their reaction. My father's jaw had tightened, a thin line of disbelief etched across his face, while my mother's hand hovered near her mouth, a gesture of shock I had seen countless times in childhood photos, but never applied to me. This was different. This was the first time I was witnessing raw, unfiltered recognition, not of love, but of astonishment. I stepped closer to the car, as if drawing a line between myself and the people who had ignored my wedding, my achievements, my very existence. "Hi," I said, my voice calm yet carrying an undertone of the years I had endured. "I didn't expect to see you here." My words were measured, each syllable deliberate. The way they fumbled, the hesitation in their posture, revealed the truth. They were caught off guard, their carefully maintained indifference shattered by the glint of a machine they recognized as a marker of success. My mother finally spoke, her voice unsteady. "Tiffany, is that yours?" The ellipsis hung between us like a fragile thread, each second stretching into an eternity. I nodded slowly, feeling the subtle power of the moment. "Yes," I replied simply. "I've worked for it." The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any grand declaration I could have made. It was not an invitation for praise. It was a factual assertion of my independence, a statement that my life no longer required validation from those who had long refused to give it. They exchanged a glance, a fleeting moment that spoke volumes. My father's face flickered between pride, jealousy, and a buried sense of shame. My mother's lips pressed together, her eyes darting between the car and me as though trying to reconcile the daughter they had overlooked with the woman standing confidently before them. The dynamic was almost cinematic, a tableau of human emotions distilled into a few brief gestures, a confrontation without words, yet more revealing than any speech could have been. David, sensing the tension, stepped slightly closer to me. His presence was grounding, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this moment, that my achievements and recognition were not dependent on parental approval. "It's beautiful, Tiffany," he said softly. His tone was gentle, but it carried a quiet insistence. This was ours, our triumph, our proof of survival. I squeezed his hand in response, a silent acknowledgement of the years we had endured together, the countless late nights and invisible struggles that had led to this moment. As they approached cautiously, I felt a subtle shift in the air. People in the parking lot began to glance over, drawn by the red Porsche and the tension radiating from the small cluster of figures. It was almost surreal, ordinary strangers witnessing a deeply personal confrontation without context. Yet I realized that this moment, banal as it seemed to the untrained eye, was the culmination of years of struggle, silent endurance, and the quiet rebellion of a life built without their acknowledgement. My mother cleared her throat, attempting to mask her surprise with a veneer of casual conversation. "We didn't know you were capable of this," she said, her voice faltering mid-sentence. I studied her carefully, noting the careful avoidance of emotional depth, the thin attempt at acknowledgement without genuine warmth. I responded with a small smile, careful not to let my internal satisfaction spill over. "It's not about being capable for anyone else," I said softly. "It's about doing what I needed to do for myself." My father finally found his voice, though it trembled slightly. "I didn't realize," he began, trailing off as if the words themselves had betrayed him. I let the silence linger, aware of the subtle power in not rushing to fill it. There was a shift in the balance of the moment, a recognition that control had quietly moved from them to me. After years of dismissals, ignored milestones, and invisible struggles, the scales were tipping not through confrontation, but through the undeniable presence of achievement. A small incident broke the tension. A neighbor pushing a shopping cart glanced over, their eyes widening at the sight of the Porsche and the clustered figures. "Wow," they murmured audibly, unintentionally punctuating the moment with social validation. My parents noticed the glance and subtly straightened, the awareness of external perception pressing against their reactions. I realized then that part of their shock wasn't just the car. It was the recognition that others, even strangers, could see what they had missed. As the conversation continued, I noticed subtle behavioral cues that revealed their inner conflict. My father fiddled with his watch, a nervous tick I remembered from childhood, while my mother adjusted her handbag repeatedly, as if seeking reassurance. Their reactions were human, real, and deeply satisfying to witness, not because I relished their discomfort, but because it affirmed the reality that years of neglect had consequences. The invisible child they had ignored had grown into a woman who could no longer be overlooked. David, sensing my need to maintain control, gently guided me to stand slightly apart. "Let them process," he murmured quietly. I nodded, understanding instinctively. This wasn't a moment for emotional outbursts or immediate forgiveness. It was a quiet assertion of presence, a reclamation of the narrative that had long been denied to me. The Porsche had become a silent witness to resilience, a symbol that could not be ignored, a physical manifestation of the life I had built despite years of invisibility. We lingered in the parking lot longer than intended, each second steeped in subtle tension. My parents asked cautious, perfunctory questions, their words carefully neutral, yet each one carried the weight of recognition they had long denied. I responded with calm, measured honesty, providing just enough information to assert independence without giving them the satisfaction of emotional leverage. The balance of power had shifted quietly but undeniably, and the subtlety of the moment made it all the more satisfying. Finally, as we prepared to leave, I allowed myself a small, private acknowledgement of the journey that had led to this moment. Every late night at work, every careful savings plan, every invisible struggle against neglect and indifference had culminated in this, an ordinary Saturday transformed into a symbolic victory. The Porsche, gleaming in the sunlight, was not just a car, it was a testament, a reminder that even invisible struggles could produce undeniable outcomes, and that recognition, when it came, could arrive on one's own terms. The moment felt suspended in time. the heat of the afternoon sun bouncing off the red Porsche and casting long shadows across the asphalt. I could feel my heart pounding, a rhythm louder than the faint hum of cars in the distance. My parents were standing a few feet away, both hesitant, their expressions oscillating between disbelief, curiosity, and something that looked suspiciously like guilt. I could almost taste the tension in the air, bitter, thick, and impossible to ignore. "Hi," I said again, my voice calm, steady, but carrying an unspoken weight. David stood slightly behind me, offering quiet reassurance, a protective presence that I had come to rely on over the years. My mother's lips pressed together, her eyes darting from me to the Porsche and back again, as though trying to decipher what had changed in the years she had ignored. My father's posture was rigid, his hands fiddling with his belt buckle, a small, nervous gesture that betrayed his surprise and discomfort. You didn't tell us you bought this," my mother finally said, her tone uneven, an awkward mixture of astonishment and curiosity. I tilted my head slightly, letting the silence stretch for a beat longer than necessary. There wasn't much reason to. I replied softly, a subtle firmness underlying my words. "It's mine. I worked for it." The simplicity of the statement carried more meaning than elaborate explanations could have. Every word was deliberate, each one a small assertion of independence, a boundary I wasn't willing to let them cross lightly. My father cleared his throat, finally speaking after a long pause. I just didn't realize you were capable of something like this," he said, his voice cracking slightly, betraying his unease. I studied him, noting the subtle cues, the tightening around his eyes, the brief downward glance, the way he shifted his weight nervously. It was as if the years of dismissal and neglect had left him unprepared for the reality that I had not only survived, but thrived. David stepped a fraction closer, sensing the tension building in me, and whispered, "You don't owe them anything." I nodded imperceptibly, feeling the truth of his words settle in my chest. And yet the confrontation had a magnetic pull. I couldn't walk away just yet. This was my moment, the culmination of years of invisible struggle, a chance to assert that my existence was not contingent on their acknowledgement. The conversation grew tense quickly as my mother attempted to regain control with her familiar combination of politeness and passive pressure. "We just didn't know," she said again, as if repeating herself would fill the void of the last decade of absence. "We would have come to other things if we'd known you needed us." I felt a flicker of anger, the old familiar heat rising to the surface. Years of ignored birthdays, missed graduations, holidays spent alone. How many times had I heard this vague excuse in my head, rehearsed like a broken record? Yet I forced myself to stay calm. "Mom," I said softly, but with clarity, "this isn't about what you would have done. It's about what you didn't do. You skipped my wedding. You skipped milestones I needed you for. And now you're here, reacting to a car." My words hung in the air, sharp but measured, cutting through the polite veneer they had tried to maintain. I could see the flicker of recognition in my father's eyes, a brief acknowledgement of the reality I had lived through. Their reactions were almost comical in their awkwardness, but beneath the surface, I could sense a genuine struggle to process the situation. My father scratched the back of his neck, his eyes flicking away, while my mother fidgeted with her scarf, twisting it nervously around her fingers. It was the same subtle discomfort I had seen in childhood photos, back when I was desperate for approval that never came. Only now, the dynamic had shifted. The child who had once waited for acknowledgement had become a woman capable of asserting her presence and demanding respect, even if it came awkwardly. A passerby glanced at the trio, nodding casually at the Porsche and the tense figures gathered near it. I caught the brief attention, realizing that their shock wasn't just private, it was public, observable. Part of me couldn't help the small, almost imperceptible smirk that flickered across my lips. For the first time in years, they weren't in control. The world around them had witnessed a reality they couldn't ignore, that I existed and I had carved out a life on my own terms. I didn't buy it to impress anyone, I added quickly, anticipating the judgment in their eyes. I bought it because I could, because I earned it, because I wanted to prove to myself that I am capable. The words felt good as they left my mouth, a cathartic release of years of pent-up frustration. My mother's eyes flickered downward, her hands tightening briefly before she adjusted her posture, an unconscious attempt to regain composure. My father opened his mouth, closed it again, and simply exhaled through his nose, a subtle acknowledgement of defeat that spoke louder than words. Then, in an almost comical turn, my father tried a joke, awkward, fumbling, but unmistakable. "Well, I guess you've made quite the statement," he said, attempting lightness. I studied him carefully, noting the tension beneath the surface of his words. "Yes," I said quietly, my voice calm but resolute. "I've made a statement, one that doesn't require your approval to exist." The air between us felt taut, like a string pulled to its breaking point. It was a delicate dance of words, each carefully chosen, each carrying layers of meaning built from years of neglect and silent endurance. The awkwardness intensified as my mother tried to shift the conversation to safer territory, pointing toward the grocery carts and the mundane errands around us. "Well, are you going to drive it around town, or just keep it here?" Her words sounded casual, but the edge of curiosity and thinly veiled envy was clear. I smiled faintly, letting the small question hang. "We're going to enjoy it," I said simply. "It's ours, not anyone else's concern." The simplicity of the response seemed to disarm them slightly, though the tension remained palpable. David, sensing the need for a subtle intervention, asked if we should head to the market first, offering a quiet escape from the mounting tension. I nodded, silently agreeing, but I could tell my parents were reluctant to step away, caught between the desire to engage and the realization that their absence over the years had put them on unfamiliar footing. They were confronting a reality that had matured while they remained static, and that mismatch created an almost tangible awkwardness, like the space between two worlds colliding. As we walked toward the store, the tension followed us. My parents lingered near the car, glancing repeatedly as though seeking permission or trying to gauge the impact of their delayed recognition. I noticed a small incident that encapsulated the absurdity and poignancy of the moment. A young couple nearby pointed toward the car, whispering among themselves, clearly impressed by its sleek design. My parents noticed the gesture and straightened instinctively, subtly aware of the social validation that contrasted sharply with the decades of private neglect. When we reached the grocery store, my father attempted another small comment, this time softer, more measured. "It's impressive," he said quietly, avoiding eye contact. I nodded politely, noting the shift in tone. His acknowledgement was not warmth, not pride. It was recognition, the barest acknowledgement that I existed as more than the invisible child he had treated me as. That was enough for me. I didn't need affection. I needed acknowledgement, and it had arrived, awkward, hesitant, and slightly public. A minor incident inside the store highlighted the subtle tension further. As I reached for a can on the top shelf, my mother instinctively offered help, her hands brushing mine. I paused, noticing the almost apologetic gesture, and gently took the can myself. "I've got it," I said softly, a small assertion of independence, and in that tiny moment, the power dynamics shifted again. She hesitated, realizing that even the smallest action, something as trivial as grabbing a can, was now a reflection of the autonomy she had failed to nurture over the years. The confrontation lingered longer than I anticipated. the mundane setting of the parking lot and store aisle contrasting sharply with the intense emotional stakes. Each exchange, each glance, carried layers of meaning built over decades of neglect. I felt a quiet satisfaction, not in humiliating them, but in witnessing their struggle to process a reality they had long ignored, that I had survived, thrived, and demanded recognition in my own terms. By the time we finished our errands, the tension had not dissolved, but it had transformed. My parents no longer approached me with dismissive gestures or subtle superiority. Instead, they moved with caution, aware that the dynamics had shifted irrevocably. I realized walking back to the Porsche that the confrontation had achieved its purpose, not through anger or dramatic spectacle, but through quiet, undeniable assertion. I slid into the driver's seat, David beside me, and took a deep breath, feeling the smooth leather under my fingers and the subtle vibration of the engine beneath me. My parents lingered for a moment longer, reluctant to retreat entirely before finally heading to their own car. The awkwardness remained, but it was tempered by recognition, a subtle, almost imperceptible acknowledgement that I had grown beyond the years of invisible struggle, that I had carved a space for myself they could no longer ignore. The drive home was quiet, the city unfolding around us in a soft blur of movement and light. I realized that the confrontation, awkward as it had been, was transformative. It was not revenge in the dramatic sense. It was the reclamation of presence, the assertion that my life, my achievements, and my existence were no longer negotiable. And in that quiet reflection, I understood something crucial. Acknowledgement doesn't have to come in warmth or love. It can come simply in the recognition that the invisible has become visible, undeniable, and real. The drive home from the grocery store felt different that day. The city hummed softly around us, sunlight glinting off car windows, casting fleeting shadows across the dashboard. David's hand rested lightly on mine, a familiar comfort after the tension-filled encounter with my parents. The silence between us was not empty. It carried a weight of understanding, of shared victories, and quiet triumphs. For the first time in years, I realized that acknowledgement didn't have to come from those who had long withheld it. I could exist fully without their approval, and that was liberating. Parking the Porsche in front of our apartment, I took a moment to breathe deeply, feeling the vibration of the engine through the steering wheel as though it was grounding me. The car had been more than a status symbol. It was a reminder of endurance, of invisible struggles turned into tangible achievements. For months, I had invested late nights, savings, and emotional labor into making this reality possible. Yet now, after my parents' awkward confrontation, I understood that the true value of my accomplishment was not in their recognition, it was in the freedom it represented. As we stepped inside, the familiar smells of our apartment, coffee lingering from the morning, the faint aroma of laundry detergent, felt like a cocoon of safety. I sank into the couch, pulling David close, and allowed myself a rare moment of vulnerability. "It's strange," I said quietly, how much weight I carried, waiting for them to see me. David nodded, brushing a loose strand of hair from my face. "You don't need their approval," he replied softly. "You've already earned everything on your own." His words, simple as they were, struck a chord deep within me. The first night after the confrontation was restless. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the awkward exchanges in the parking lot. My parents' hesitations, the subtle gestures, the nervous glances, they all lingered in my mind. And yet, alongside the tension, I felt a subtle release. I had faced them without anger, without shouting, without needing to justify my existence. The confrontation had been awkward, yes, but it had been mine. It had been honest. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of peace, a quiet acknowledgement that I could live fully without relying on them for validation. Over the following weeks, life settled into a rhythm, but the lessons from that day remained vivid. Each morning, as I brewed coffee and watched sunlight spill across the kitchen counter, I reflected on the distance I had traveled. The years of invisible struggle had taught me resilience, patience, and self-reliance. The Porsche had been a milestone, a visual testament to my hard work, but the real transformation had been internal. I no longer measured my worth through the eyes of those who had neglected me. I measured it through the life I had built and the values I chose to honor. Small incidents reminded me of this new equilibrium. One morning, I received a call from a colleague, excitedly informing me of a promotion opportunity. In the past, I might have second-guessed my worth, worrying whether I truly deserved the recognition or silently hoping my parents would someday validate it. Instead, I felt a quiet confidence. "I can handle it," I said simply, smiling at David across the room. "I've worked hard for this, and it's mine to claim." The words were not directed at anyone but myself, yet the weight they carried was immense. Even mundane errands became moments of reflection. Walking through the farmer's market, selecting fresh vegetables and chatting with vendors, I noticed the subtle shift in my perception. I no longer felt the gnawing ache of absence at family gatherings or social events. Instead, I observed, engaged, and participated fully, free from the silent anxiety that had haunted me for so long. Every small action, from bargaining for produce to laughing with strangers in the checkout line, became an affirmation of independence. I began to indulge in things I had long denied myself, not out of vanity, but as acts of self-affirmation. A painting class on Tuesday evenings, a weekend pottery workshop, even a quiet solo hike at the nearby state park. These moments became sacred rituals of self-expression. I realized that seeking validation externally had once been a cage. Now, embracing my passions and interests was liberating. Each step, each decision, was a quiet rebellion against years of invisibility and neglect. Even family interactions changed subtly. My younger brother, who had always been supportive in small, understated ways, became a confidant in my journey. We spent afternoons reminiscing over shared memories, reflecting on how our parents' absence had shaped us differently. "You're stronger than they'll ever realize," he said quietly, his voice tinged with admiration. I nodded, feeling the warmth of sibling connection as a balm to old wounds. Their acknowledgement was genuine, rooted in shared history rather than societal obligation, and it helped me see that meaningful recognition could exist outside the parental lens. One evening, David and I hosted a small dinner for close friends in our apartment. The warmth of the gathering, filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and casual conversations, was a vivid contrast to the tension-filled encounter with my parents. I realized then that peace wasn't about grand gestures or public acknowledgement. It was about surrounding oneself with those who celebrated your presence and achievements authentically. Each toast, each shared story, reinforced the lesson that approval, while desirable, was not necessary for fulfillment. A particularly poignant incident occurred when I received an unexpected note from a former mentor, praising the work I had done in my career and encouraging me to pursue further opportunities. The validation from someone who truly understood my efforts carried a profound weight. I held the note for several minutes, absorbing the acknowledgement, and felt a wave of calm sweep through me. In that moment, I understood that meaningful recognition often comes from sources aligned with your journey, rather than from those bound by obligation or expectation. Even interactions with my parents, though occasional, became manageable in this new perspective. When my mother called to ask about a family gathering, I responded politely without expectation or emotional upheaval. "We'll be there," I said calmly, "but it's our choice, not because we need approval." The simple phrasing reflected my newfound clarity. I could participate without relying on validation, engage without compromising my autonomy, and live fully without surrendering to old patterns of neglect. As weeks turned into months, the sense of peace deepened. The Porsche, once a symbol of triumph over struggle, now represented freedom and self-reliance. Every drive through the city, the hum of the engine beneath my hands, the smooth response of the steering wheel, all served as reminders that I was no longer defined by absence or dismissal. I existed fully, independently, and authentically. A small but significant incident occurred when I helped a neighbor with a flat tire. The gratitude in their eyes, the simple handshake, and the quiet conversation reaffirmed my understanding of impact beyond familial approval. Acts of kindness, competence, and engagement with the world became measures of self-worth that required no parental acknowledgement. I realized that validation could be self-directed and externally reinforced in ways that truly mattered. The real breakthrough came one quiet morning, sitting on the balcony with David, coffee in hand, sunlight spilling across the cityscape. I watched the cars passing below, the rhythmic flow of everyday life, and felt a profound sense of calm. The past, with all its struggles and unmet expectations, felt like a chapter one could now observe without being trapped in its narrative. I had confronted the absence, acknowledged the pain, and reclaimed my life, not through confrontation, but through living fully. Even the smallest gestures of independence, from preparing meals to planning weekend trips, carried a new sense of affirmation. I reveled in the autonomy, recognizing that self-worth was cultivated through choices, consistency, and presence, rather than borrowed validation. Each decision, each moment of mindfulness, reinforced that I could create peace without approval. One day, while walking through the park, I noticed a young woman sitting alone on a bench, visibly upset. Something in her posture, the slumped shoulders, and the distant gaze mirrored feelings I had carried for years. I sat beside her, offering a gentle smile, and asked if she was okay. She looked up, startled, and I simply said, "I know what it feels like to feel invisible, but you exist and your life matters." That small interaction, the ability to empathize without judgment or expectation, crystallized the truth I had discovered. Peace and validation could be shared, cultivated, and internalized without needing permission from those who had once withheld it. Months later, I found myself reflecting quietly in the quiet of our living room, the sun casting long shadows across the floor. The Porsche gleamed outside, a silent monument to perseverance, but more importantly, a reminder that peace wasn't a gift to be granted. It was something earned, cultivated, and owned. I had learned to exist fully, to thrive independently, and to celebrate my life without relying on anyone else's acknowledgement. The years of struggle, the awkward confrontations, the silent resilience, they all culminated in this quiet mastery of self. I understood finally that the absence of approval did not diminish my achievements. Rather, it highlighted the power of autonomy, the strength of self-directed validation, and the profound liberation that comes with embracing one's own worth. I poured myself another cup of coffee, feeling the warmth seep into my hands, and watched the sun dip toward the horizon. David squeezed my hand gently, and I smiled. This was peace, quiet, profound, and entirely my own. I didn't need applause, acknowledgement, or approval to feel complete. I existed, I mattered, and I thrived, and that was enough. As the evening settled around us, the city lights flickering on one by one like distant stars, I finally allowed myself to pause and reflect on everything that had brought me to this moment. The years of struggle, the invisible battles fought behind closed doors, the hollow milestones where my achievements went unnoticed, all of it felt both heavy and strangely liberating at once. I realized that for so long, I had measured myself by the yardstick of my parents' acknowledgement, trying to squeeze my life into a framework that was never meant to include me. And yet now, standing on the other side of all that absence and pain, I understood something profound. I didn't need their validation to exist, to thrive, or to feel proud of who I had become. The Porsche in the driveway, gleaming in the soft glow of streetlights, was not the point. It was merely a symbol of the life I had claimed for myself, a life built on resilience, quiet determination, and self-respect. I thought about the awkward confrontation in the parking lot, the hesitant words my parents had finally managed to speak, and I smiled softly. Their shock, their fumbling attempts at acknowledgement no longer had the power to wound me. I felt the weight of freedom settle into my chest, a warm, grounding force that I hadn't realized I was longing for so desperately. I had spent years waiting, hoping, longing for love and recognition that had been withheld. But in that waiting, I had also built myself, layer by layer, decision by decision, victory by victory. I had learned to celebrate myself, to find joy in the ordinary, to savor the quiet moments of accomplishment that no one else might notice. And in doing so, I had discovered something even more precious than their recognition. I had discovered my own worth, unwavering and undeniable. David squeezed my hand gently, breaking my thoughts, and I looked over at him with gratitude. He had been my constant, my anchor, and my witness through every single triumph and setback. Together, we had built a life that was ours, independent of the shadow of neglect, independent of anyone else's opinions or approval. And that life, I realized, was the true victory. It wasn't about proving anything to them or anyone else. It was about proving to myself that I could exist fully, unapologetically, and with quiet strength. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air brush against my face, carrying with it the sense of the city, faintly of asphalt and coffee, of autumn leaves drifting from nearby trees. For the first time in years, I felt a calm certainty that this life, my life, was enough. I didn't need applause, congratulations, or recognition from those who had turned away. I had built a world where I was seen, where I was loved, where I mattered, and that was more than enough. The pain of the past still lingered, a shadow occasionally brushing against my thoughts, but it no longer defined me. Instead, it reminded me of how far I had come, how strong I had become, and how much I had learned to rely on myself. As I looked out at the city, the lights reflecting softly on the hood of the Porsche, I whispered quietly to no one in particular, "I exist. I am enough. And I am free." In that moment, the weight of longing, the ache of invisibility, and the scars of neglect were replaced by a steady, enduring peace. I knew I would carry the lessons of the past with me forever, but I also knew that my happiness, my fulfillment, and my sense of self would never again depend on the approval of anyone else. This was my life, my story, and my triumph, and finally, for the first time, I could savor it without hesitation, without guilt, and without reservation.